Stop worrying about what others say and discover your identity. What if the life you are living right now is not actually yours? Not because you made the wrong choices, but because you were never given the space to truly choose. Pause for a second and really think about this. How many of your decisions came from your own internal conviction, and how many were silently influenced by the fear of being judged, rejected, or misunderstood? There is a subtle force that shapes almost everything you do. It does not demand attention loudly. It operates quietly in the background, guiding your behavior without permission. Be accepted. Be approved. Do not make people uncomfortable. Do not risk being seen differently. And over time, without even noticing, you start adjusting yourself to fit into that invisible framework. You begin to filter your thoughts before you speak. You change your reactions to avoid conflict. You adapt your personality depending on who is watching. At first, it feels like social intelligence, like you are simply being aware, considerate, adaptable. But there is a line that most people cross without realizing. The moment you stop expressing who you are and start performing who you think you should be, that is where the disconnection begins. And the most dangerous part is that it feels normal, because everyone else is doing the same thing, living in a loop of silent approval seeking, constantly measuring themselves through the imagined perception of others. But here is the reality that most people avoid facing. The more you build your identity around what others might think, the less access you have to who you actually are. You become skilled at being accepted but lost when it comes to being authentic. You learn how to belong but forget how to exist as yourself. And over time, this creates a quiet internal conflict, a sense that something is off, even when everything looks fine from the outside. Because deep down you know, you are not fully showing up as who you are. You are presenting a version that has been edited, refined, and shaped to minimize rejection. And the cost of that is higher than most people are willing to admit. Because when you disconnect from your own identity long enough, you reach a point where you no longer know what is truly yours. Your preferences become unclear. Your opinions feel uncertain. Your direction feels borrowed. And this is where most people stay. Not because they want to, but because they do not know there is another way. But there is a shift that can happen. A moment where you begin to question everything that once felt automatic, not in a destructive way, but in a liberating one. Because the moment you start questioning the voices that shaped you, you begin to separate what is truly yours from what was imposed on you. And that is where your real identity starts to emerge, not as something you find instantly, but as something you uncover layer by layer. And what you are about to understand next is where that process truly begins. The voice that is not yours. There is a voice inside your mind that feels completely natural. It sounds like your own thoughts. It reacts instantly. It judges, compares, and evaluates everything around you. And because it has always been there, you rarely question it. You assume it is you. But that assumption is where most people get trapped. Because that voice was not created in isolation. It was built over time, piece by piece, through experiences, interactions, and repeated exposure to external opinions. Think back to the moments that shaped you. The times you were corrected, the times you were criticized, the times you were praised for fitting in or discouraged for standing out. You should behave like this. That is not how people do things. You need to be better than that. At first, those voices came from outside parents, teachers, friends, society. But over time, something changed. You internalized them. They stopped being external guidance and became internal commands. Now they speak from within, as if they belong to you. And that is what makes them so powerful. Because when a voice comes from the outside, you can question it. But when it feels like it comes from inside, you tend to obey it without resistance. This is how conditioning becomes identity, not by force but by repetition. The more you hear something, the more familiar it becomes, and the more familiar it becomes, the more true it feels, even when it is not. This internal voice starts shaping how you see yourself. It defines what you believe you are capable of. It limits what you allow yourself to try. It controls how you respond to opportunities and challenges. And most importantly, it filters your identity before you even have the chance to express it. You are not reacting to reality directly. You are reacting to an interpretation of reality that was influenced by other people's perspectives. And the longer you operate like this, the more distance you create between who you are and who you think you are. Because your thoughts are no longer a clear reflection of your authentic self. They are a mixture of inherited beliefs, learned fears, and borrowed expectations. But here is where everything starts to change. The moment you realize that not every thought in your mind is truly yours, that awareness alone creates space. Space to pause, space to question, space to choose differently. Because if a thought can be observed, it can also be challenged. And if it can be challenged, it does not control you anymore. So instead of accepting every internal voice as truth, you begin to ask, where did this come from? Is this still relevant? Does this actually represent who I am? And slowly, something shifts. You stop reacting automatically and start responding consciously. You begin to separate your real voice from the noise that was never yours to begin with. And once that separation happens, you are no longer operating on autopilot. You are stepping into awareness, and that is the first real step toward discovering your identity, the invisible theater of social life. Every day, without realizing it, you step onto a stage, not a physical one, but a psychological one. A space where you are constantly being watched, evaluated, and interpreted. At least, that is what your mind wants you to believe. So you adjust. You choose your words more carefully. You control your expressions. You calculate your reactions. Not because you are being forced to, but because you feel like you are being observed. This is the invisible theater of social life, a place where most people are not living. They are performing. And the most fascinating part is this. The audience you are trying to impress is not even paying attention because they are on their own stage, performing for their own imaginary audience. Think about it. While you are worried about how you look, how you sound, how you are being perceived, other people are doing exactly the same thing. They are thinking about themselves, their insecurities, their image, not yours. But your brain does not process it that way. It creates a constant illusion of attention. It tells you that people are noticing every detail, that they are analyzing your behavior, that they are forming opinions about you in real time. And because of that, you start acting differently. You do not express your full thoughts. You hesitate before being honest. You adjust your personality depending on who is around. Not because it feels right, but because it feels necessary. This is where authenticity starts to fade. Not in a dramatic way, but in small, almost invisible adjustments. You become slightly more agreeable, slightly less expressive, slightly more cautious. And those small changes accumulate over time, until one day, you are no longer sure which version of you is real, the one you are when you are alone, or the one you present when others are around. And here is the deeper layer of this dynamic. The performance never truly ends. Even when you are not physically around others, the audience remains in your mind. You replay conversations, you imagine reactions, you anticipate judgments. You are not just performing in front of people, you are performing in front of their imagined perception of you. And that is what makes it so exhausting, because you are constantly managing an identity that was never meant to be managed this way. You are trying to control how you are seen instead of understanding who you are. And the more you invest in that performance, the more disconnected you become from your own reality. Because your focus shifts outward. You stop asking what you think and start prioritizing what will be accepted. But here's the truth that changes everything. The stage only exists if you believe in it. The moment you realize that most people are too focused on themselves to truly analyze you, something begins to loosen. The pressure decreases. The need to perform weakens. the fear of being judged starts to lose its intensity. And in that space, something unfamiliar appears. Freedom. Not the kind that comes from approval, but the kind that comes from detachment. You start to speak more honestly. You start to act more naturally. You start to exist without constantly editing yourself. And that is when the performance begins to collapse. Not because you forced it to end, but because you no longer need it. But this creates a new tension, because once you step off the stage, you are faced with something most people spend their lives avoiding. The question of who you are without the performance. And what comes next is where most people realize how deep this goes. The myth of the perfect image. There is a version of you that exists only in your mind, a version that is always composed, always confident, always admired, always in control. It looks right, sounds right, behaves exactly the way you believe it should, and without realizing it, you start chasing it. Not as a goal, but as a standard. A silent expectation that shapes how you see yourself every single day. You compare your real self to this imagined version. And no matter what you do, it never feels enough. Because the image you are trying to reach is not real. It is constructed, built from fragments of what society rewards, what people praise, and what seems acceptable. It is a combination of external validation patterns, not internal truth. But your mind does not treat it that way. It treats it as a requirement. So you begin adjusting. You refine how you speak. You control how you appear. You monitor how you are perceived. Not to express who you are, but to reduce the gap between you and that image. At first it feels like growth, like you are improving, evolving, becoming better. But there is a subtle shift that most people miss. You are no longer growing into yourself. You are shaping yourself into something else. Something more acceptable, more polished, more aligned with what is expected. And that comes with a cost. Because the more you invest in maintaining an image, the more you disconnect from your reality. You stop asking what feels true and start asking what looks right. You stop making decisions based on alignment and start making decisions based on perception. And over time, this creates pressure. A constant need to sustain the image you have built, to avoid slipping, to avoid being seen differently, to avoid breaking the illusion. Because once people recognize you through that image, you feel responsible for maintaining it, even if it no longer represents who you are. This is where anxiety begins to grow. Not because something is wrong externally, but because internally you are divided. There is who you are, and there is who you feel you need to be. And the distance between those two creates tension. A tension that cannot be resolved by trying harder. Because the problem is not your effort. It is the standard you are trying to meet. The idea that you must be consistent, impressive, and acceptable at all times. But here is what changes everything. The perfect image does not exist in reality. It only exists as a projection. And the more you try to live inside that projection, the less present you become in your own life because you are constantly managing how things appear instead of experiencing how they actually are. You are not living fully. You are editing in real time. And that prevents you from accessing something far more powerful than perfection: authenticity. Because authenticity does not require you to maintain an image. It requires you to remove one, to stop performing consistency and allow complexity, to stop controlling perception and allow honesty. And that shift is uncomfortable at first because it removes the structure you have relied on. It exposes parts of you that do not fit the ideal, but it also does something else. It gives you back access to yourself. Not the version you think you should be, but the one that already exists beneath the surface. And once you start seeing that clearly, another layer begins to reveal itself. One that has been shaping your decisions without you even noticing: the weight of unspoken expectations. There are expectations in your life that no one ever clearly explained to you. No one sat you down and defined them step by step, and yet, you feel them. You sense them in conversations. You notice them in reactions. You absorb them through silence. They are not written, but they are present, an invisible pressure guiding how you behave, what you choose, and who you try to become. You learned early that certain actions bring approval and others bring discomfort, distance, or subtle disapproval. So you adapted. Not through force, but through observation. You started reading between the lines, adjusting your behavior to avoid tension, aligning yourself with what seems acceptable. And over time, this became automatic. You no longer question why you do certain things. You just feel that you should. That quiet sense of obligation becomes part of your identity. You follow paths that feel expected. You make decisions that seem appropriate. You avoid choices that might create friction, even when those choices feel right to you. This is the weight of unspoken expectations. It does not demand attention directly, but it influences everything. And the most difficult part is that it feels reasonable because it is not extreme. It is subtle, gradual, almost invisible. You tell yourself you are being responsible. You believe you are doing what makes sense. You convince yourself that this is just how life works. But underneath that logic, there is something else happening. You are slowly disconnecting from your own internal guidance. You are prioritizing alignment with others over alignment with yourself. And the more you do that, the harder it becomes to recognize what you actually want. Because your decisions are no longer based on clarity. They are based on avoidance. Avoiding disappointment. Avoiding conflict. Avoiding being seen as different. And this creates a quiet tension. Not loud enough to force change, but persistent enough to create dissatisfaction. A feeling that something is off, even when everything appears stable. You may achieve what was expected. You may follow the path that makes sense. You may meet the standards that were never spoken and still feel misaligned. Because expectations, when unexamined, do not lead to fulfillment. They lead to compliance. And compliance over time erodes identity, because every time you choose what is expected over what is true, you reinforce a version of yourself that is not fully yours. But here is where awareness changes everything. The moment you begin to question those expectations, you interrupt the pattern. You start asking, is this something I actually want? Or is this something I learned to want? Is this decision aligned with me? Or is it aligned with what others would approve of? And those questions create space. Space to see clearly. Space to choose intentionally. Space to step out of automatic behavior. Because once you recognize that many of your decisions were influenced by expectations that were never truly yours, you regain something powerful: agency. The ability to decide based on internal alignment rather than external pressure. And as that awareness grows, another realization begins to surface. One that challenges a belief you may have carried for a long time. The idea that people are constantly watching and judging you. The illusion of constant judgment. There is a belief that quietly shapes how you move through the world. The idea that people are watching you, evaluating you, forming opinions about you more often than they actually are. It feels real. It influences how you speak, how you act, how much of yourself you allow to be seen. You assume that small mistakes are noticed, that awkward moments are remembered, that your choices are being analyzed. And because of that, you adjust. You hold back. You overthink. You try to minimize anything that could be judged. But here is what most people never stop to consider. Everyone else is doing the exact same thing. They are not focused on you. They are focused on themselves, their own insecurities, their own image, their own fear of being judged. This creates a paradox. You feel observed, but so does everyone else. You feel evaluated, but everyone else is too busy evaluating themselves. And yet, your mind does not register that. It creates a spotlight that follows you everywhere, making you feel like you are constantly on display. This is not reality. This is perception, a distortion that exaggerates how much attention you actually receive. And this distortion has consequences, because when you believe you are being constantly judged, You begin to live defensively. You avoid risks. You avoid expression. You avoid anything that could expose you to criticism, not because those things are dangerous, but because they feel dangerous, and that feeling becomes your guide. You do not choose based on what matters to you. You choose based on what feels safe from judgment. This is where your world starts to shrink. Opportunities that require boldness are ignored. Ideas that challenge norms are suppressed. Parts of your personality remain hidden, not because they are wrong, but because they might not be accepted. And over time, this creates a version of your life that is carefully controlled, but deeply limited. Because you are not navigating reality. You are navigating your interpretation of how others might react, and the cost of that is subtle, but significant. You trade authenticity for comfort. You trade growth for approval. You trade truth for safety. But here is where everything shifts. The moment you begin to question this belief, ask yourself honestly, how often are you truly analyzing other people in the way you assume they are analyzing you? How often do you remember their small mistakes, their awkward moments, their imperfections? Most likely, you do not. Because your attention is already occupied with your own experience, and the same is true for them. This realization does not eliminate judgment from the world. People will always have opinions, but it changes the scale of it. It shows you that the constant spotlight you feel is not external. It is internal. And once you see that clearly, something begins to loosen. The pressure to be perfect decreases. The fear of being seen differently weakens. The need to control every impression starts to fade. You begin to act with more freedom. Not because judgment disappears, but because it loses its power over your decisions. And in that space, a deeper conflict starts to emerge. One that goes beyond perception, a tension between two fundamental human needs, the need to belong and the need to be real. The conflict between belonging and being authentic. There is a tension inside you that most people never fully understand. It does not show up as a clear problem. It shows up as hesitation, doubt, and internal negotiation. A constant balancing act between two powerful needs, the need to belong and the need to be yourself. Both feel important, both feel necessary. But in many moments, they pull you in opposite directions. Because belonging often requires adjustment. It asks you to align with the group, to follow unspoken rules, to behave in ways that feel familiar to others. While authenticity asks something very different. It asks you to express what is true for you, to speak honestly, even when it creates discomfort, to act in ways that may not be understood. And this is where the conflict begins, because you start to feel that being fully yourself might cost you connection. That if you show everything you are, you might not be accepted in the same way. So you negotiate. You reveal parts of yourself, but not all. You express opinions, but only the safe ones. You act naturally, but within limits. You become strategic with your own identity. Not because you are being false, but because you are trying to protect something. Your place, your acceptance, your sense of belonging. And this strategy works, at least on the surface. You fit in, you avoid rejection, you maintain harmony. But underneath that, something starts to build. A quiet dissatisfaction. Because even though you are connected to others, you are not fully connected as yourself. You are accepted, but only partially known. And over time, that creates a subtle disconnection, not from others, but from you. Because every time you choose belonging over authenticity, you send a message to yourself that who you truly are is not enough on its own. And that message, repeated enough times, begins to shape your identity. You start to believe it. You start to rely on external validation to confirm your worth. And the more you rely on it, the harder it becomes to act independently of it, because now your sense of security is tied to how you are received. But here is the truth that most people avoid. Belonging that requires you to hide parts of yourself is not real belonging. It is conditional acceptance. And while it may feel comfortable in the short term, it creates instability in the long term. because you are constantly maintaining it, constantly adjusting, constantly monitoring, constantly making sure you do not step outside the invisible boundaries. And that is exhausting. Not physically, but mentally and emotionally, because you are managing two realities at once, who you are and who you feel you need to be. But there comes a point where this becomes unsustainable, where the cost of not being yourself becomes greater than the risk of being seen. And that is where a shift begins. Not necessarily dramatic, but intentional. You start testing the edges, speaking a little more honestly, acting a little more freely, allowing yourself to be seen more clearly. And what you begin to notice is something unexpected. Some people will not respond the same way. Some connections may change. Some reactions may feel uncomfortable. But at the same time, something else happens. You feel more aligned, more stable, more certain of who you are, because you are no longer splitting yourself to maintain acceptance. You are integrating yourself, even if that changes how others perceive you, and that is where real belonging starts to take a different form. Not as something you earn by adjusting, but as something that emerges when you are fully present as yourself. And once you begin to experience that, another pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The habit of constantly filtering yourself before you even have the chance to be real. The trap of self-editing. Before you speak, you adjust. Before you act, you calculate. Before you show anything real, you run it through an internal filter. Not once, but constantly. You review your words, you predict reactions, you reshape your expression before it even exists outside your mind. And it happens so fast that you rarely notice. It feels natural, like you are just being careful, thoughtful, socially aware. But what you call awareness is often something else. Control. A subtle, continuous attempt to manage how you are perceived. You are not just communicating, you are editing, cutting parts of your thoughts that might be misunderstood, softening ideas that might create tension, replacing authenticity with something more acceptable. And the more you do this, the more automatic it becomes. You no longer ask what you want to say. You ask what is safe to say. You no longer act based on what feels true. You act based on what will be received well. This is the trap. Because self-editing does not feel like suppression. It feels like refinement. It feels like you are improving your expression, when in reality, you are limiting it. You are shaping your identity around reactions that have not even happened yet. And over time, this creates a gap between what you think and what you say, a gap between what you feel and what you show, a gap between who you are and who others experience. And that gap becomes your default state. You get used to it, you adapt to it, you start believing that this version of you is the real one. But it is not. It is a controlled version. A version designed to minimize friction and maximize approval. And while that may seem effective, it comes with a hidden cost, because every time you edit yourself, you reinforce the idea that your raw, unfiltered self is not enough, that it needs adjustment, that it needs improvement, that it needs to be managed, and that belief slowly shapes your confidence. Not in an obvious way, but in a subtle one, you begin to hesitate more. You second-guess your instincts. You rely less on your natural expression, because you no longer trust it fully. You trust the edited version more than the real one. And that creates dependency. A dependency on control, on preparation, on anticipation, on avoiding mistakes before they even exist. But here is what breaks this pattern: the realization that authenticity is not something you perfect, it is something you allow. It does not require constant correction. It requires permission. Permission to express without overanalyzing. Permission to speak without rehearsing. Permission to act without predicting every possible outcome. And yes, that comes with risk. You may say things imperfectly. You may be misunderstood. You may create moments that feel uncomfortable. But those moments are real. They are not filtered. They are not constructed. They are not edited to fit expectations. And that is where something important happens. You start experiencing yourself directly, not through a controlled version. You begin to trust your natural responses. You reconnect with your instincts. You reduce the distance between who you are and how you show up. And that shift changes everything. Because once you stop editing yourself constantly, you begin to notice something deeper. How much of your identity has been shaped not just by control, but by adaptation, a constant adjustment depending on where you are and who you are with. And that realization leads to the next layer, the identity in constant adaptation. Pay attention to how you change depending on where you are, not in obvious ways, but in subtle shifts. The tone of your voice changes. The way you express ideas changes. Even your sense of humor adjusts. You become slightly different versions of yourself in different environments. With one group, you are more reserved; with another, more expressive. In some situations, more confident. In others, more cautious. At first, this seems normal. It feels like flexibility, like you are simply adapting to context, reading the room, behaving appropriately. And to a certain extent, that is true. Adaptation is part of social intelligence. But there is a point where adaptation stops being functional and starts becoming identity distortion, when you are not just adjusting your behavior, but reshaping who you are depending on who is present. When there is no stable core, only versions. And the more you rely on those versions, the harder it becomes to identify which one is actually you. Because each version feels real in the moment, each one is convincing, each one is accepted in its own context. But when you step back, something feels off. A sense that you are fragmented, not fully aligned, as if you are constantly shifting but never fully grounded. This is the effect of constant adaptation without awareness. You become highly responsive to external environments, but disconnected from your internal consistency. You know how to fit in anywhere, but you do not know where you truly stand. And that creates instability, because your identity becomes dependent on context. Instead of being something you carry with you, it becomes something you assemble in real time, based on expectations, dynamics, and perceived reactions. And while this may make social interactions smoother, it weakens your sense of self, because you are no longer acting from a defined center. You are reacting to external cues. And over time, this leads to a quiet confusion. You start asking yourself questions that are difficult to answer. What do I actually believe? What do I actually prefer? What do I actually want? Not in theory, but in reality. Because your answers have been shaped by the environments you have adapted to, not by a clear internal reference. But here is where the shift begins. The moment you start observing these changes instead of automatically participating in them, you notice when your behavior shifts. You recognize when your expression adjusts. You become aware of how context influences you, and that awareness creates distance. Distance between you and the automatic adaptation. And in that distance, something becomes possible. Choice. You can still adapt when necessary, but you are no longer controlled by it, are not losing yourself in the process. You are adjusting your expression, not your identity. And that distinction is critical, because it allows you to remain consistent internally, even when external situations change. You are not fragmented. You are flexible, but grounded. And that grounded state reveals something important. How much noise has been influencing you all along? Not just through people, but through constant stimulation, information, and external input. Which brings you to a realization most people avoid. If you want to hear your own voice clearly, you need to reduce everything that is not yours. Silence is a tool for clarity. You are constantly surrounded by noise, not just external noise, but mental noise. Opinions, content, conversations, expectations, information flowing in without pause. At every moment, something is influencing how you think, what you should do, who you should be, what matters and what does not. And the more you consume, the less space you have to hear yourself. Because your mind is not empty. It is occupied. filled with inputs that shape your perception before you even have time to question them. You scroll, you listen, you react. And in the middle of all that, your own voice becomes quieter. Not because it disappeared, but because it is being drowned out. This is why so many people feel lost. Not because they lack identity, but because they have no space to access it. They are constantly absorbing, rarely observing, constantly reacting, rarely reflecting, and, without reflection, clarity is impossible because clarity does not come from more information. It comes from less interference. This is where silence becomes powerful, not as absence, but as a tool, a deliberate reduction of external input, a conscious decision to step back from everything that is trying to shape you. When you remove the noise, something uncomfortable happens at first. You are left alone with your thoughts. No distraction, no immediate validation, no external direction. And that can feel unsettling, because you are no longer guided by what is around you. You are confronted with what is within you. Your doubts become clearer. Your questions become louder. Your inconsistencies become visible. And most people avoid this moment. They go back to noise, back to distraction, back to anything that prevents them from facing that internal space. But if you stay there, something begins to change. Slowly, your thoughts start organizing themselves, not based on what you have consumed, but based on what you actually think. You begin to notice patterns. What feels right, what feels forced, what aligns, what does not. You start separating external influence from internal truth. And that separation creates clarity. Not instant answers, but a clearer direction. Because you are no longer reacting automatically. You are observing before deciding, and that changes the way you relate to yourself. You begin to trust your own perception more. Not because it is perfect, but because it is yours. You are not relying on constant input to define your next move. You are allowing space for your own understanding to emerge. And in that space, something else becomes clear. You realize how much of your previous decisions were influenced by noise you never questioned. How many opinions you adopted without examining, how many directions you followed without choosing. And that realization shifts your perspective. You stop looking outward for constant guidance and start looking inward for alignment. But this creates a new challenge. Because once you begin to see clearly, you are faced with a choice to act on that clarity, or to ignore it and return to comfort, and acting on it requires something most people struggle with. The willingness to be misunderstood. The courage to not be understood. At some point, clarity forces a decision. Not about what you know, but about what you are willing to stand for. Because the moment you begin to act from your own understanding, something changes. You stop aligning automatically with what others expect. You start making choices that reflect your internal direction, and that is where friction begins. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are no longer predictable. People are used to versions of you that fit within certain expectations. They understand how you respond, they anticipate your behavior. They feel comfortable with the version of you they know. But when you begin to act from clarity, that familiarity breaks. You say things they did not expect. You choose paths they do not understand. You respond in ways that do not match the pattern. And this creates confusion, not just for them, but for you, because you are stepping into territory that is unfamiliar, a space where you are no longer guided by approval, but by alignment, and that space comes with a cost. You may not be understood immediately. You may be questioned. You may even be judged. Not because your actions lack value, but because they do not fit into the framework others are used to. And this is where most people retreat. They return to what is familiar. They adjust themselves again. They choose comfort over truth because being understood feels safe. It reinforces belonging. It confirms acceptance. It reduces tension. But here is what most people fail to see. Being understood is not always a sign that you are being true to yourself. Often, It is a sign that you are being predictable, that you are staying within the boundaries others recognize. And when you step outside those boundaries, misunderstanding becomes inevitable. Not as a failure, but as a consequence. Because people interpret you based on their own perspectives, not your intentions. They see through their experiences. They judge through their expectations. They react based on what makes sense to them. And that has very little to do with who you actually are. This is why seeking to be fully understood by everyone is impossible, and more importantly, unnecessary, because your responsibility is not to control how others perceive you. It is to remain aligned with what you know to be true, even when it creates discomfort, even when it leads to silence instead of agreement, even when it changes how people relate to you. This is what courage looks like in practice. Not loud, not dramatic, but consistent. The willingness to act without needing immediate validation. The ability to move forward without full approval. The strength to accept that not everyone will see you clearly and still continue. Because once you stop needing to be understood by everyone, something shifts. You stop explaining yourself excessively. You stop justifying every decision. You stop adjusting your identity to fit into someone else's interpretation. You begin to stand in your own position, not rigidly, but firmly. And that creates a different kind of stability. One that is not dependent on agreement, but on self-trust. And from that point, a new phase begins. One where you are no longer just reacting to who you have been, but actively shaping who you are becoming. The conscious reconstruction of self. There comes a moment when awareness is no longer enough. You see the patterns, you recognize the influences, you understand what has been shaping you. But understanding alone does not change your identity, because identity is not just something you uncover, it is something you build. And this is where most people hesitate, because reconstruction requires responsibility. It means you are no longer reacting to what shaped you. You are choosing what will define you, moving forward. And that choice is not automatic, it is deliberate. You have to decide what you value, what you stand for, what you are no longer willing to carry, not based on what feels familiar, but based on what feels true. And that distinction is critical, because familiarity often comes from conditioning, while truth comes from alignment. So you begin to question deeper, not just what you think, but why you think it. Not just what you do, but why you do it. And through that process, you start identifying what actually belongs to you. Some beliefs remain because they resonate. Others fall apart because they were never yours. This is not a comfortable process, because letting go of old patterns creates uncertainty. You are no longer operating from what is known. You are stepping into something that is still forming. And in that space, there is no script, no predefined path, no guaranteed approval, no clear validation, only direction, a direction that you define through your choices. And this is where reconstruction becomes real. Not in theory, but in action. You start making decisions that reflect your values, even when they are not the easiest ones. You stop defaulting to old responses and begin choosing new ones intentionally. You notice when you are about to repeat a pattern and pause, not to analyze endlessly, but to decide differently. And those decisions, repeated over time, begin to shape a new structure. A structure that is not built on external expectations, but on internal consistency. You become more stable. Not because everything is certain, but because your decisions are aligned. You trust yourself more. Not because you are always right, but because you are intentional. And that changes the way you move through the world. You are no longer trying to find yourself in reactions. You are expressing yourself through choices, and that creates clarity. Because identity is no longer something you question constantly. It is something you experience directly, through what you accept, through what you reject, through how you act when no one is guiding you. But there is one final layer that completes this process. A habit so deeply ingrained that most people never question it. The need to explain themselves. to justify who they are, what they choose, and why they live the way they do. And breaking that habit is what solidifies everything. Detachment from the need to explain. There is a subtle behavior that keeps you tied to other people's opinions, even when you believe you have moved past them. The need to explain yourself, not always out loud, but internally. You justify your decisions, you rehearse your reasons, you prepare arguments for choices no one even questioned yet. It feels responsible. It feels like clarity. It feels like you are making sure you are understood. But underneath that, there is something else driving it. The desire for approval. Because when you explain yourself constantly, you are not just communicating. You are seeking validation. You are trying to make your decisions acceptable in the eyes of others, even when those decisions are already aligned with you. And this is where the contradiction appears. You may have clarity about who you are. You may have defined your values. You may be making intentional choices. But if you still feel the need to justify them, you are still partially dependent on external acceptance. You are still negotiating your identity, not in your actions, but in how you present them. And that keeps you connected to the same cycle. Because every explanation opens space for interpretation, for disagreement, for doubt, for influence. You say what you are doing, you explain why you are doing it. And in return, you receive opinions that you now feel compelled to consider. Not because they are necessary, but because you invited them. And slowly, without noticing, you start adjusting again. Not fully, but slightly. Just enough to reduce resistance. And that is how the pattern continues. Even after you have done the work of understanding yourself. This is why detachment is necessary. Not detachment from people, but from the need to be validated by them. Because your decisions do not become more valid when they are understood by others. They become more stable when they are aligned with you. And that stability does not require constant explanation. It requires confidence. The kind that does not need to convince. The kind that does not need to defend. The kind that allows you to act without constantly translating your choices into something acceptable for everyone else. This does not mean you never communicate. It means you are intentional about when and why you do. You explain when it adds value, not when it reduces discomfort. You share when it is relevant, not when it seeks approval. And that shift is subtle but powerful, because it closes a loop that most people never escape. The loop of acting, then justifying, then adjusting. Instead, you act and move forward, without overanalyzing how it will be received, without revisiting your decision to make it more acceptable, without carrying the weight of other people's interpretations. And in that space, something becomes clear. You no longer feel the need to constantly manage how you are perceived, because your focus is no longer on perception, it is on alignment. And that alignment creates a different kind of presence, one that is not reactive, one that is not dependent, one that is not easily influenced. And once you reach that point, something shifts permanently. You are no longer navigating yourself through others. You are standing within yourself. And that is where everything stabilizes. The moment you become unbreakable. There is a point where everything you have been questioning, observing, and rebuilding comes together. Not as a dramatic transformation, but as a quiet shift. A moment where something inside you stabilizes. You no longer feel the same internal pressure. You no longer react the same way. You no longer depend on the same external signals. It is not that the world changed. People still have opinions. Judgment still exists. Expectations are still present. But your relationship with all of it is different, because you are no longer anchored to those things. You see them, but they do not define you. You hear them, but they do not control you. You acknowledge them, but they do not move you away from yourself. This is what it means to become unbreakable. Not immune, not indifferent, but grounded. You feel things, but you are not ruled by them. You listen, but you are not shaped by every voice you engage. but you do not lose your center. And this changes how you move through life. Decisions become clearer. Actions become more direct. Your presence becomes more stable, because you are no longer negotiating your identity in every situation. You are carrying it with you, consistently, without needing to adjust it to be accepted. And there is a calm that comes with that. Not the calm of comfort, but the calm of certainty. You know where you stand. You know what aligns. You know what does not. And that removes a weight you may not have even realized you were carrying. The constant need to evaluate yourself through others. That need disappears. Not because you forced it away, but because it no longer makes sense to you. You stop asking how you are being perceived and start focusing on how you are actually living. You stop adjusting to avoid judgment and start acting in alignment with what is true. And in doing so, you gain something that cannot be given by anyone else. Authority over yourself, not in an external sense, but internally. A self-trust that does not depend on agreement, a clarity that does not collapse under pressure, a stability that is not shaken by temporary opinions. And this is where your identity becomes real. Not as an idea, not as a concept, but as something lived. Something expressed in your actions, your decisions, your presence. You are no longer searching for who you are. You are being who you are. Fully, consistently, without needing permission. And that is the moment. Everything changes, not because the world recognizes it, but because you do. And from that point forward, you are no longer reacting to life. You are leading yourself through it.